Hey, old man. Nobody cares about those dusty names anymore. The insult echoed across the square. Sharp and ugly, Elias Monroe didn't lift his head. He dipped his rag into a battered bucket and wiped another name on the forgotten memorial slow and steady. People passed without a glance. A few laughed. Most just looked away. But an hour later, the rumble of drums shook the air and the entire military parade halted. Not for a mayor, not for a speech, but for the man who polished memory into gleaming defiance. If you believe silent honor deserves the loudest salute, comment honor below. Every Saturday morning, Elias Monroe walked to Monroe Veterans Plaza before sunrise. His old boots scuffed across cracked pavement. In one hand, he carried a battered metal bucket. In the other, a faded cloth memorial plaques lined the square, dulled by years of neglect. He scrubbed each one carefully, washing away grime, dust, and time itself. Passersby hurried past him, busy with their errands. Teenagers skateboarded nearby, music blaring from their phones. Vendors set up stalls without a second glance at the old man. Elias whispered names under his breath as he worked. Names he once knew, faces he never forgot. He replaced wilted flowers when he could. He never asked for help. He never expected thanks. His heart saluted every name he polished. The morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the square. Elias moved methodically from plaque to plaque, his weathered hands gentle. Pigeons scattered as he approached the World War II memorial. His fingers traced each letter before cleaning began. Sometimes he paused longer at certain names, eyes distant. The square slowly filled with weekend shoppers. Children pointed curiously before being pulled away by parents. Elias kept working through lunch hour, ignoring his growling stomach. He carried water for the dried-out planters near the Korean War memorial. No one had maintained them for months. Summer heat blazed down, but he never rushed. His baseball cap, faded navy blue, shielded his eyes from the glare. Sometimes he spoke quietly to the memorials, sharing private jokes, or perhaps apologies, or promises kept through decades of faithful service. By midday, sweat ran down his neck. The cloth grew darker with each stone it touched. He changed the water in his bucket 4 times. His back ached. His knees protested. Still, he continued with unwavering focus. The city council had discussed removing some of the older memorials. Dated, they called them taking up valuable space. Elias had attended the meeting silently. He never spoke at the podium. He simply stood at attention in the back of the room. The resolution was mysteriously tabled that night. As afternoon approached, he polished the brass dedicatory plaque. His reflection stared back at him, distorted but dignified. 78 years had etched deep lines around his eyes, but they still held the same intensity as the young soldier in the photograph he carried. The photograph stayed tucked in his breast pocket, close to his heart. Near closing time, shopkeepers nodded to him from their doorways. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement he typically received. It was enough. He gathered his supplies as the sun began its descent. Another Saturday complete. 6 days until he would return again. 6 days of waiting to resume his silent duty. Memorial Day arrived with bright skies and louder crowds. The town buzzed with energy for the annual parade. Banners snapped in the breeze. Children waved little flags. Vendors sold popcorn and soda along the sidewalks. Elias arrived earlier than anyone else. As always, he polished the Korean warm-up memorial. First kneeling quietly, a group of teenagers laughed as they passed. Still cleaning up the past, old man, one jeered. Elias ignored them, his rag moving steadily. Nearby, a soda can clattered across the pavement. He stooped, picked it up, and tossed it without a word. The first drums rolled in the distance, signaling the parade's start. Rows of soldiers in full dress uniforms marched into view. Brass bands filled the air with proud, swelling music. Elias moved to the Southeast Asia War Memorial. His cloth passed over names of boys he once called brothers. As the parade reached Monroe Veterans Plaza, a decorated general in the lead jeep caught sight of Elias. The general's expression hardened. His hand rose sharply. Drums stopped mid-beat. Boots stomped to a sudden halt. Every head in the parade turned toward the solitary old man kneeling at the stone. The general stepped down from his jeep. He crossed the street slowly, the crowd falling silent. Standing before Elias, he raised a crisp salute. Soldiers behind him mirrored the gesture in perfect unity. The town square held its breath as hundreds of hands rose in respect. Elias looked up, momentarily confused by the sudden silence. His arthritic fingers still clutched the damp cloth. Recognition flickered across his face as he saw the general. Slowly, painfully, he rose to his feet, his spine straightened with muscle memory from decades past. Though his uniform was long gone, His posture spoke of service. The general's voice carried across the hushed square. Staff Sergeant Elias Monroe. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded once, eyes steady. 3rd Battalion, 73rd Airborne Brigade. The general continued. Dacto, 1969. Elias swallowed hard, the names on the memorial suddenly blurring. At ease. Sergeant, the general said, his voice softer now. The crowd remained frozen, witnessing something they didn't fully understand. A photographer from the local paper captured the moment. Elias's weathered face, the general's unwavering salute, the names gleaming behind them both. Children tugged at parents' sleeves, asking questions in stage whispers. Who is he? What did he do? Few had answers. The parade announcer's microphone screeched with feedback. Ladies and gentlemen, he began uncertainly, we're experiencing an unscheduled moment. Someone in the crowd, a Southeast Asia veteran recognizing a brother, started clapping. The applause spread like wildfire through the square. Elias looked down, uncomfortable with the attention. His hands stained with polish and decades of quiet service hung at his sides. The general stepped closer, speaking words only Elias could hear. Whatever was said made the old man's eyes shining with unshed tears. They stood there, 2 soldiers separated by rank but united by sacrifice. The general reached into his pocket and pressed something into Elias's palm. The bronze star gleamed in the midday sun. You left this behind, the general said loud enough for those nearby to hear. Elias's fingers closed around the medal he'd never claimed, the one he'd left at the field hospital when he learned none of his men would be coming home. They deserve the recognition, sir, Elias said, his voice rusty from disuse. Not me, they have it, the general answered. Through you. Every Saturday, the parade remained at attention, no one daring to break the moment. A former soldier with a prosthetic leg pushed through the crowd, then another veteran, and another. They formed a small semicircle behind Elias. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The parade master looked questioningly at the general. The general nodded. Proceed when ready. But before the drums resumed, the general turned to address the crowd. Remember this moment, he commanded, voice ringing with authority. This is what honor looks like. The parade continued, but something fundamental had shifted. As Elias returned to his knees, back to his humble task, he was no longer invisible. Every eye watched him now. Every heart recognized what had been overlooked for years. If you believe silent loyalty should never be forgotten, comment, stand tall below. Phones came out, flashes blinking across the square. Local news captured the moment live. Parade stops for unknown hero headlined every major outlet that night. Within hours, the image flooded social media feeds nationwide. Veterans groups shared the story with pride. Reporters quickly found out who he was. Elias Monroe, age 78, Southeast Asia veteran, awarded 2 Bronze Stars for bravery in battle, lost his entire platoon in a firefight in '69, survived to tell no one. The mayor held a press conference apologizing for years of overlooking local heroes. Monroe Veterans Plaza was unanimously renamed Monroe Veterans Square by town council. A special plaque was installed where he knelt in honor of silent service and undying memory. Schools launched a namekeeper program for students to adopt and maintain memorials. Teenagers volunteered to clean and restore every plaque across the city. Every Memorial Day parade now paused at the new Monroe Veterans Square. Veterans stood with hands over hearts. Citizens bowed their heads without being told. Elias's phone rang constantly for 3 days straight. News stations wanted interviews. Publishers offered book deals. He declined them all with gentle firmness. His neighbors left gifts on his porch. Home-cooked meals, cards, flowers. The local hardware store delivered a new bucket and supply. On the house, the note read, "With respect, Elias." Landlord called to say his rent was paid for the year. Anonymous donor, he claimed. Though his voice cracked suspiciously, the general returned on Tuesday, this time without fanfare. They sat on Elias's porch swing, talking quietly for hours. Old wounds were opened, old memories shared. Healing doesn't always come when expected. Sometimes it arrives decades late on an ordinary afternoon. The following weekend, Elias approached Monroe Veterans Plaza with apprehension. Would they let him continue his ritual now that it had become public? Would cameras and onlookers change what had always been private communion? He arrived at dawn, bucket in hand, to find he wasn't alone. A dozen veterans stood waiting, some with canes, some in wheelchairs. They nodded silently to Elias, respecting his space. Without discussion, they dispersed to different memorials. The quiet scrubbing of claws replaced morning bird song. By mid-morning, families arrived with children, Parents explained in hushed tones what the clean stones represented. Young faces listened with unusual solemnity. A local coffee shop sent over thermoses for the volunteers. The city parks department delivered fresh flowers without being asked. Elias worked steadily, accepting the community forming around him. This wasn't about him. It had never been. It was about remembrance passed from one generation to the next. By noon, a reporter approached, camera crew in tow. Elias tensed, but the reporter simply set down her microphone. She picked up a cloth and knelt beside him at the Southeast Asia Memorial. "My father served," she said simply. "Cameron Bay, 1970. Elias nodded, making room for her beside him. The camera crew filmed from a respectful distance. The story aired that evening without a single interview, just images of silent work and shared purpose. The following week, City Council approved funding for memorial restoration. The mayor presented the plan at a veterans breakfast. Elias attended reluctantly, uncomfortable in his freshly pressed shirt. "This isn't about creating a tourist attraction," the mayor clarified. "It's about restoring dignity to our promises." Plans included improved lighting, weather protection, and educational panels. But most importantly, dedicated staff to maintain what Elias had preserved alone. When asked to speak, Elias stood briefly. "Remember their names," he said simply, then sat down. The room erupted in applause. Those 3 words became the project's official motto. 3 months later, the renovations were complete. Elias was asked to cut the ribbon at the rededication ceremony. He deflected, suggesting instead that local Gold Star families should do the honor. As they gathered with scissors poised, Elias stood at attention nearby, not as the center of attention, but as a guardian of memory, just as he had always been, just as he would always remain. Elias Monroe returned to the square the following Saturday. Same boots, same battered bucket, same gentle reverence in every movement. Children ran up with fresh rags and flowers. Volunteers knelt beside him, cleaning quietly without orders. He smiled small and proud, but said little. Honor wasn't about parades or speeches. It was about remembering. His hands, though slower now, still polished each name like a prayer. Flags flew a little straighter above the memorials he loved. The square no longer belonged to history textbooks. It belonged to living memory. The sound of scrubbing cloths and fluttering flags replaced old laughter and mocking voices. Some victories are not shouted. Some are polished, one name at a time. The teenagers who had once jeered now volunteered regularly. They learned to recognize the difference between cleaning and honoring, between obligation and privilege, between forgetting and remembering. Elias taught without lectures, showed without demonstrations. His example was eloquence enough. Winter came with bitter winds that stiffened his joints. Still, he arrived each Saturday, now wearing gloves with the fingertips cut off. The city installed a small heated shelter nearby for supply storage. They claimed, though the coffee pot was always full, spring brought school field trips to the square. Children sat cross-legged on the pavement as Elias shared stories, not of his own heroism, never that, but of ordinary men who found extraordinary courage when needed, of friendships forged in impossible circumstances, of promises kept across decades and oceans, of names that deserved to shine. A documentary filmmaker approached with respect and patience. After weeks of building trust, Elias agreed to sharing his story, not for fame but for education. The film premiered at the local theater to a standing room-only crowd. Elias watched from the back row, quietly and emotional. His story inspired similar initiatives in neighboring communities. Veterans stepped forward to become guardians of their own memorials. A national movement grew organically, powered by respect rather than obligation. On Elias's 80th birthday, hundreds gathered at the square, not to celebrate him but to work alongside him. The gift he appreciated most, 200 new cleaning cloths and 1,000 promises to continue what he had begun. As the years passed, Elias slowed but never stopped. When stairs became difficult, a ramp appeared overnight. When kneeling grew impossible, someone brought him a special stool. The community adapted around his needs without drawing attention to them. His legacy wasn't built in bronze or granite. It lived in the hands that joined his every weekend, in the children who learned history from touch rather than textbooks, in the veterans who found healing through service, in the shining names that would never again be forgotten. Elias Monroe had never sought recognition. He had only sought to recognize others, and in doing so, he taught a community and eventually a nation that true honor lies not in receiving accolades, but in giving remembrance. Subscribe to Steelheart Stories if you believe true heroes carry memories, not medals.